don't be intimidated by the notion of like poetry. It's not the poetry that's setting it apart. It's the idea. Come up with the ideas. The writing will follow.
Welcome to Beyond the Lens, presented by Diesel Films. I am Seth Shapiro.
And I'm AJ Speaks.
On today's show, we welcome Aaron Cohen, a living legend in the world of sports media. As the premier writer in sports television, Aaron has won 30 National Sports Emmys and a record 9 Dick Schaap Writing Awards. Aaron has helped produce some of the most iconic storytelling in sports, including HBO's 24/7, NBC's Olympic Games coverage, and has written on some of our favorite sports docs, including the Fab Five, Magic and Bird, A Courtship of Rivals, and McEnroe Borg, Fire and Ice.
Aaron tells us how his big break actually went down in the lunchroom at ABC. He shares the details of his writing process, and we take a deep dive into his directorial debut when New York was one, a doc he directed during the pandemic. Here is Beyond the Lens from Diesel Films.
Special show today. Not only have I had the privilege to work with this person, but in my opinion, the best writer in the history of sports television, my friend, Aaron Cohen. Aaron, welcome to Beyond the Lens.
It's great to be with you guys. Thank you. It's an honor.
That's a hell of an introduction right there, Seth. I like that.
It can only go downhill from there.
Aaron, we like to break the podcast up into 3 acts, like a film. And the first act being your story. Growing up, did you always have a knack for writing?
Maybe. I always liked writing. I think, I liked school and I liked creative writing. I think I'd be lying if I would say that when I was a kid, I thought I could make a living essentially being a creative writer and writing about sports, But I think the closest thing I ever came to having a goal in the business would have been maybe I could write print one day, write for Sports Illustrated or something like that. But, I think it's cool to look back and say that I ended up doing a job that's really cool. That's a dream job, but I didn't necessarily know existed, beforehand, like working in the field of, sports television and sports documentaries. But I certainly, always enjoyed being creative and yeah.
Where did you grow up and when did you know you would get into filmmaking or sport and working in sports?
Yeah. So, I grew up in Long Island, AJ, in a town called Manhasset, which is on the North Shore of Long Island. It's actually a famous lacrosse town, and also famous for the fact that maybe the greatest lacrosse player in the history of the sport grew up there. A guy named Jim Brown, who actually, as anybody would know, made his fame in football in the NFL. But little known fact, or not as well known, Jim Brown was also a hell of a lacrosse player and played at Syracuse. So yeah, I grew up loving sports, not being that great at playing sports, but was always kind of interested in media and I guess in looking back, storytelling, worked in the school newspaper. Even one time, senior year of high school, was fortunate enough that my high school had a program, and this, I bet schools have this all the time now, but my high school had like a little bit of an AV program, and they broadcast a football game through on the local community access, like the local access cable show. And all the kids were manning cameras, and like the AV teacher was like actually directing. And me and my friend George Sodorakis were the play-by-play and color guys for the game. And I still have a picture, that somebody took of a still. I'm wearing like a sport coat with like a ski coat over it, just looking ridiculous. And at halftime, we ran out and changed into our marching band outfits and played in the marching band for like our thing, and then ran back and then, picked up the broadcast. So that's the kind of kid I was. Yeah.
A jack of all trades, without a doubt. So you went to Harvard. I'm a state school UMass guy. AJ went to Seton Hall. Talk to us about the Harvard experience. Did it live up to those expectations? We don't know too many people that graduated from Harvard, but talk to us about that Harvard experience.
Sure. I would say you guys had a lot more fun, for sure. And it was like, it's funny, the best thing about Harvard for me was not the classes. I honestly didn't really take to the whole academic setting. The best thing about Harvard were the kids you met, like, and the friends you made, or I made. And, I happened to make some really, really good friends who've done really, really well since college. But at the time, we met basically at the school paper, which was called the Harvard Crimson. And that was, and that's another thing that Harvard did provide. If you work in the school paper at Harvard, you're working at basically something that's its own business. It's like totally independent from the school. It's endowed by, its own wealthy alumni, but like I said, it's totally independent, and you're putting out a daily paper every day or every night. And I actually was the editor, not of like the sports section, but like kind of the weekend magazine, like the equivalent, like the New York Times magazine. And that was like the best experience I could have had, just working with like passionate people. And that was our, fun. Some people go out in bars and some people are doing whatever. Like for us, I was pulling an all-nighter every week, every Tuesday night, to get the magazine to be printed on Wednesday to come out on Thursday. And that was my thing. And that's like kind of what furthered that sort of passion for writing, for media, and that kind of steered me, towards the path I ended up taking. So, those are the best memories of Harvard.
I worked for Tommy Amaker at Seton Hall, and
Sure.
head coach of Harvard. And that's what he tells me when I talk to him. He talks about that's what he sells his players, all those experiences and all the people you're going to meet, because a lot of them aren't going to the NBA, but those experiences like you described are what make them and set them up for the rest of their lives. So it's interesting that you have that same path that they have.
Totally. And so, that's what I'm most fortunate, I feel, about. Yeah.
My question for you is, growing up in Long Island, I know that there's a Mets, Jets, probably Knicks. What teams were your teams? And give me the rank. Give me the order.
So, AJ, you said it, man. It's that, I don't know, I wish there was a name for it, but it's like that infamous trio, like Mets, Jets, Knicks. And it wasn't that way growing up, at least with the Knicks, So great question, like perfectly phrased, right? So I fell in love with sports when I was 7. And I was born in 1978. I'm going to be 43 in June. So, and in 1985, when I start kind of figuring out sports, here come the Mets. And my dad did what he has said is his greatest regret in life. He turned me into a Met fan. Like, he kind of had me watching the Mets. He goes, why did I do this? Like, you should have, made you a Yankee fan. Would have been better. But no, made me a Met fan. And so I become a Met fan in like sometime in 1985. First Met game I went to, July 22nd, 1985. Mets win 16-4. Darryl Strawberry hits the ball off the scoreboard in right center. And it's just like, wow, this is amazing. This is a lot of fun. This is a good team. The next year, the Mets not only just win the World Series, sorry, Seth, but they do it in, a magical, mystical, immortal way. And I'm like, wow, this whole sports thing is amazing.
Broke our heart.
No, broke your heart. Sorry, but.
Yeah. But yeah. Look, man, look, guys, 35 years later, I have not won another championship with my team. It's interesting. I probably got into the Knicks like a few years later, around like Rick Pitino, Johnny Newman, Joe Wilkins era with Ewing. And the Mets kind of faded in the 90s, and the Knicks became, the team. And so I would put them 1 and 2. Mets, I guess 1A, Knicks 1B, but it's obviously been exciting this year with the Knicks getting back. And it's just crazy because the 90s were Knicks, and then I, right when I graduated college in 2000, then the Knicks, fell off the map. The funny thing about the Jets is I was a Giants fan growing up in terms of them winning the Super Bowls in 86 and 90, but then I had some cousins who were Jets fans, some older cousins, and I kind of remember, not literally but figuratively, looking in the mirror and being like, you know what? I should be a Jet fan. And by the way, this is like the Rich Kotite era. It was like right before Parcells, and I was like, I should be a Jet fan. And so I've been a Jet fan ever since. Like it was weird. It just kind of came to me when I was like, 13 or 14. So,
that's such a painful combination, Mets Jets. Those
it's brutal.
Boys, oh man, it kills you every time.
Brutal.
We love beating the Jets. I have to say that.
I mean, yeah, and you have no problem doing it. It's very easy. Yeah, exactly.
The Patriots have beaten the Jets pretty handily over the last 20 years.
We'll see. There's always hope. I like this new coach. He seems like he's got a plan. So we're staying hopeful.
Big break into the industry as a writer. Talk about your big break.
My big break was between my sophomore and junior years of college. My mother says to me, "You can't be a camp counselor anymore. You got to start figuring out what you want to do with your life." through a connection, I get the best TV internship that I could get, which was an internship at The View, which was the Barbara Walters chat show on ABC, which is still on today, though Barbara Walters is no longer on it. That show, perhaps not surprisingly in retrospect, was the show that everyone's niece, nephew, doctor's son or daughter had an internship at. So there were like 35 interns, and not a lot for anybody to do. I was really fortunate. A wonderful writer by the name of Andrew Smith, who was a comedy writer on the show, writing jokes, took a liking to me and said to me, what are you doing here? Like, this is, like, what do you like? And I was like, well, you like sports? And I was like, yeah, I like sports. Again, hadn't really thought of the fact that, like, it was like, no, work was supposed to be something that was not fun. And it's like, I can't work in sports. That's too fun. Like, no, sports. He goes, come to the cafeteria, on the ABC cafeteria on Tuesday at 2:15. I'm having lunch with a guy at 1:00. Come up to the table and act like you just kind of, are just stumbling on. And I'm going to introduce you to this guy. We're going to get you an internship in sports. And that guy's name, who I met, was a guy named Brian Brown, who is a terrific television sports writer, who I introduced myself to. And 2 weeks later, had moved my internship to an internship at Monday Night Football, which was in kind of pre-production at the time. It was a pregame show for Monday Night Football at ABC Sports. And that was a big break for me because Brian was, he's, again, a great writer, a great producer, and who became a great friend, but was just so much the kind of guy who would just do anything for, to help somebody out, and so he got me a job the next summer at the X Games. He helped get me a job the year after I graduated at the Sydney Olympics, and then at HBO Sports subsequent to that. And I really owe everything to him. And the neat thing is that he was a writer. He would write, the opening to the Olympics, like I've done for NBC, and he would write all kinds of other stuff. And so I saw that as something neat, in terms of how you can tell stories in sports and the art of it and the craft of it. And that caught me going. And I've sort of, in some ways, followed in his footsteps, and I've done other things. But, that was definitely, I think my biggest break, even looking back, going all the way to, becoming a writer.
What a great story.
Man.
Yeah.
Brian,
and I'm sure, like, you guys are the same, like, as you go forward, and, like, whenever a young person asks me if they want to get into the business, can I talk to you? I always say yes, and it's just, you just do what you can. Just give someone a foot in the door. And then if they knock it down, great, but it's just, that's just the way the business goes. So anyway.
Absolutely. And Brian Brown, one of the great tease writers of our time, just a fantastic writer all around. I mean, all the Olympic stuff that he's written has been outstanding. Yeah.
Total legend. And again, a great friend.
It's a great experiences. I worked at HBO Sports also as an intern. That was my big break, getting in as an intern there. And then going through that whole process and all the people there and writing and being involved, that seems like that was a good break for you as well after the first big break.
100%. And for years and years, HBO Sports was this, real kind of beacon of storytelling in sports, thanks to Ross Greenberg, who, there are a lot of people who have done a lot of great work, but a word that you got to be careful about throwing around, but you can say this about Ross, is a visionary. The guy had a vision that here's how we can tell stories in sports. And it evolved out of what he saw at NFL films and what Steve Sable did and what even Bud Greenspan did with his Olympic films. But HBO, and again, I imagine for, young people listening out there or young people in our business, HBO in, the 90s and the 2000s, was, before 30 for 30, HBO was where sports documentaries lived. And they you can find a lot of them you can find some on HBO Max, you can find them on YouTube, but, terrific storytelling house and just amazing people who came out of there. Even today, names that we could go through in terms of the best in the business, you'd be surprised who came out of HBO Sports. And that includes AJ, obviously. So,
hey, it's funny you mentioned Ross. Quick story. I didn't know him. I just called, and I called his secretary like, hey, I want to speak to Ross Green. I had read his name in a magazine and thought that I was going to get through. She was like, no. She put me through the Kindle read. Long story short, I ended up getting on as an intern, and it changed my whole career path. And from that moment on, like, I look at HBO Sports as like the mecca for me, of that experience of getting into television and being a producer.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, we all got a story, and sometimes you got to do something unconventional like that to do it, right? To get in.
So we're going to enter into our second act now, where we focus on, believe it or not, your directorial debut. I can't believe it, but which was during the pandemic last year.
Yeah.
The film was called When New York Was Won, the Yankees, the Mets, and the 2000 Subway Series, which ended up airing on Fox Sports. It was really a beautiful throwback to an exciting time to be in New York. And unbeknownst, I think, to all of us, it was the calm before the storm in 2001 when 9/11 hit. And we were all there at that time. I was there. I was working at Madison Square Garden. The Boston sports were so bad at the time that with the Knicks, who went to the finals in 99, and then the Yankees making their historic run, there was some question of whether my Boston sports loyalty, was still there. But an amazing time to be in New York, without a doubt. Talk to us how you got involved with the film.
Yeah. So as usual, again, owe it to some really good people. 2 years ago, or I don't even know, it's like time is so weird. It's, I guess, in 2019, I helped Fox out with the film. I got involved with a film about Tom Seaver, which was a Mets film. Go figure. I think the film was called Seaver. It was a really nice film that Ed Burns EP'd and narrated. And when I was done, the executive at Fox in charge of original programming and documentaries at the time, a guy named Mike Talasian, who we all might know, who I've known for a long time, Mike said, you should do one of these on your own. Fox does a series of baseball films every year as part of their, partnership and coverage of baseball. And he actually had the idea. He said, it's going to be 20 years, and 20-year anniversary of the 2000 Subway Series. Maybe you could direct one. And I kind of said, sure. Yeah. And then kind of said to myself, how am I going to do that? Because I was supposed to be at the Olympics in the summer of 2020. And, but I just, you kind of, I think, as you guys know, being out there, you sort of say yes to everything, and especially when it's a good idea. And right when we were going to kind of start figuring out what it was in March, the pandemic hit. And it was a bummer. And obviously everything got kind of slowed down. But I kept talking to Mike. And when it became apparent that baseball was going to restart, and obviously everyone's loads were a lot lighter last year, we spoke. And he said, look, he said, I'm not sure how many we're going to do, but if we do one, I think we would do this film. Could you do it? And I had two amazing partners making the film, Tim Mullen and Jackie Decker. Tim, one of the best editors in sports television, if not the best that I've ever worked with in terms of versatility, documentaries, teases, all kinds of stuff. And Jackie, who's his creative partner and just amazing at all the things that I don't necessarily do or I'm not that great at in terms of, just sort of the other things that go involved in telling a story in terms of music and pacing and look and all kinds of stuff like that. So the three of us embarked on making the film. It was in August and September. And fortunately in New York, like the numbers in COVID were pretty low. So we were able to do interviews. And I felt pretty strongly that the pandemic should be part of the show. And it was a tribute to New York at a time when New York was struggling. So it was always going to have a 9/11 component, but to kind of double up and also frame the film in terms of, a different time in New York 20 years earlier was important to me as a New Yorker to tell. And I was pretty proud of what we were able to put together.
Well, you guys did a wonderful job, but I have to be honest, I had blocked all of that out. I hadn't watched any of the series. I was there, like Seth said, but I had blocked it out. So watching it, it was good and painful memories at the same time. So my question is, how was it for you? It was hard for me to watch. How was it for you directing it and writing it and going through the whole process?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, look, number one, what's funny is like, if you watch that film, I would hope that like I was able to, hide the fact that I'm a Met fan, right? Like I hope it was from like an even perspective, right? Because, I'm not, it's like, and even when I look at things now, it's sort of like you look at something as a fan and then as like a filmmaker. So fortunately, even I can say this, and I imagine AJ, you'd agree with me, and even Seth, being a Red Sox guy, those Yankee teams, of all the Yankee teams, like in the late 90s, like that dynasty, I mean, there were a lot of things, and screw the Yankees, but like they were pretty likable, pretty admirable. Also, they had a bunch of ex-Mets. I mean, they had David Cohen, who's interviewed in the film, who was fantastic. Bernie Williams, who's a phenomenal guy. Joe Torre, former Met, classic New Yorker. So fortunately, there's admiration, on that front too. And
I'd like to disagree with you, but I was there at Game 6 down the left
Game
field
5.
line. But
Yeah.
Game 6 in
God,
in the ALCS. Sorry, in the ALCS.
0-3. Yeah.
David Justice hit
that
a
one.
3-run
Yeah.
bomb. Yep, and the crowd erupted, and I kind of got caught up in it. And I said, "Wait a second, I hate the Yankees." And I was very conflicted. I was very conflicted at that time because things were going well in New York, and there was a lot of excitement, especially working there.
Yeah, totally. And so again, I had graduated college in 2000, come back, and the Mets were good again for like the first time in a long, since the early 90s. I mean, they had a good year in 99, so it was exciting. And I actually went to Game 5 of the World Series. I was at that game, the clinching game, sitting in the right field corner in the blue seats with my mom. My dad got his tickets, and me and my mom went to the game. And so it's kind of hard for me to block it out because I was like, look, again, it's sort of like we've all worked in sports for a long time, and one of the cool things is you're up close and things like that. But after a while, things stop moving the needle, right? It's like, yeah, I've been to the Olympics, I'm going again, that kind of thing, and you can't help it. But interviewing Mike Piazza, interviewing Al Leiter, David Cohen, even Bobby Valentine, like that was really cool. And I don't often do that, as focusing on writing. And so that experience was definitely cool. And it was kind of odd because I was doing it literally from where I'm sitting right now. I was doing it, from my apartment because we had, and I know you guys, worked through the pandemic and so forth. So the camera crew was with the interview subject, but I was on a monitor on Zoom, which again was its own challenge that we were able to, overcome. And it was still, really cool.
Yeah. I think the first thing you notice about the film are the players, David Cohn, Joe Torre, Edgar Alfonso, got his mask on, he's sweating. You established it's a COVID production. Talk about some of the challenges you had producing within the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, again, like we definitely made a decision, Tim, Jackie, and I, that like we weren't going to hide that. Like we wanted it to feel like this is a film of the moment. And often you don't want to do that, right? Because you want your film to kind of live, you want, I mean, nobody's renting DVDs anymore, but when somebody watches it years later, you want it to be evergreen. But I didn't think that would interfere with that because, this is going to be an artifact of its time. And we were living in such an intense kind of acute time. We were very fortunate that, again, numbers were pretty good in New York and most of the characters were in New York. So we worked with a great DP in New York, in Queens, who had his own kind of studio setup in Astoria. And so we were able, for the most part, to bring a lot of our interview subjects there. And they kind of had a COVID safe setup. There were a few cases like where we interviewed Roger Clemens and Andy Pettit. We just kind of did it remotely in Houston and, they were comfortable doing it. And Piazza was actually in Italy. And we somehow had a connection to an Italian crew. And, I did that interview at, 5 a.m. in New York, but otherwise it was, it was seamless. It's so crazy how, for everyone in any industry, because, people have been Zooming for a year now and so forth. But, think about, if this had happened 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier, I don't think this technology would have made it as easy to do stuff. The joke is, for me, I'm always working on multiple things. And so it's kind of hard for me to like travel sometimes because I'm always kind of balancing a bunch of different stuff. And for me, like the fact that I didn't have to travel to these interviews and just sit in my apartment and then like log on, like that actually was kind of a, I would never say nothing has been good about this pandemic, but it was logistically, made it easier for me. And Tim and Jackie and I worked on so many things. So we worked very fine remotely. We typically work remotely anyway on some level when we've worked on other shows in the past. And look, Fox was great. MLB was great. And, we were proud of what we put together.
Could the players, the interview subjects, see your visual, or did they just hear your voice?
They saw me. So it was kind of like they set up a monitor on a stand, I guess. And it was just where my head would be and where they wanted me to be. So it actually like pinpointed the look. So I was like a computer screen, but yeah, we were able to establish that contact. It's funny from a creative standpoint. I don't know how deeply you want to get into it. One thing I did notice is that if I had been sitting in the same room as them, I think their voice tone would have been different. And so like, if you listen to them, it feels almost like they're shouting a little bit. It's not the sound. I think, again, that's like a nitpicky thing that only like the three of us would, as professionals, I think it all kind of works out, but there's not quite the intimacy. I think if I were doing a documentary about where I really needed to make a lasting connection with a subject, I'd want to be in person. These guys were phenomenal, don't get me wrong, but like I'm just a face to them. I wasn't like going to make a connection. So I think for the kind of film it was, that didn't really make that much of a material difference.
Can you walk us through your writing process? Maybe not just on this, but in general. I know this is a loaded question. So in a condensed way, how do you write? How do you write? How do you go about your process of writing a piece like this?
I don't know if you want to keep this in, but I love these questions. So I'll answer it now. I'll give you a cold answer, but that's just, I appreciate the question.
You might be going to bed a little late tonight. You might be going to bed a little late.
So believe me, it's the middle of the day. So in terms of a writing process, I think you have to trust your process. Everybody has their own process, et cetera, right? Like the kind of writing that I do and the kind of writing you're doing, if you're writing narration for films or if you're writing a tease, it's a different kind of writing than writing a book or writing an article and so forth. So let's break it up, right? Like even using this film as an example, I wasn't even sure how the film was going to work, but the film ended up essentially utilizing the things that I've figured out, that I like to do in terms of storytelling. It has a narrator. Kate Donovan was our narrator. The actor did a fantastic job. But the film largely opens with something of an opening essay that he kind of delivers as the narrator. And then throughout, he's obviously jumping in and out of sound bites from the characters. And then the film also ends with him having a dramatic, essay that kind of makes a point. And I've done that in different ways in all kinds of films. And for me, it's, every time it says a blank document 1 on Microsoft Word, it's a fresh start. Nobody cares how many Emmys I've won or anything like that, because what I produce next could stink, but I'm looking for, in a lot of ways, like writing ad copy. I imagine like you're looking for ways to communicate that kind of have a rhythm to them and are things that are going to echo. I believe, or I feel strongly that the writing you do for film or television is a lot different than obviously the writing you do for print, right? Because if I read a really nice passage in a novel or a magazine article, most likely I'm going to reread them. Like I'm going to reread the passage. I'm like, wow, that was great. Let me read it again. Why was that good? And wow, that was great, and so forth. Nobody's rewinding to listen to the writing again. You got one shot. So you got to be really clear and really spare. And it's got to have a certain rhythm to it. And that's why I could write, an amazing thing. And if it's not well delivered by, the narrator, then it's wasted, so that's something that you're also in partnership. And I take that pretty seriously. And, so working with the narrator on in a VO session is an important thing to do. And by the way, if you work with me in a voiceover session, like I'm not grinding you to the ground in terms of being an actor or an actress, but because then ultimately I think it loses an authenticity too. So these are all things I'm thinking about when I write, AJ. I'm not sure if it totally answers your question, but I'll say in closing that for something like the open or a close of this show or anything else, it's only like a page, right? It's only, maybe 100 to 150 words, maybe 200 words when it's something like that. But if you look at the Word document before I sort of finalize it, it probably goes on for 10 or 12 pages. There's a lot of, junk that just gets kind of thrown out. And then all of a sudden the line comes and then, and sometimes it comes easier than others. But, oftentimes, again, like I said, it's 10, 11, 12 pages just to get that one page. And it's a lot of sitting there, a lot of twiddling your thumbs, a lot of frustration, a lot of trips to, get another glass of water. It doesn't come out as easily as it might sound when it's really good. But you just got to trust your process and hopefully, again, find something, a theme that resonates. The idea is just as important as the words, right? So, if you can come up with the right idea, I think that, that's more than halfway there. That's a lot of different answers, but as you can tell, I've thought a lot about this. So.
And where you had to find your process, right? And so you worked through, and now obviously your process has been successful for you. So you just drill it down and you drill it down. Seth had a question about Tate Donovan, right, Seth?
I did, yes. But I did want to say, when I do watch a Aaron Cohen rollout, which we've seen famously on 24/7, we've seen it in this documentary, I will rewind that rollout and say, what the fuck? What did he just write? What did he just write? When Floyd Mayweather is running down the street and Manny Pacquiao, and I said, wow, some of the words, some of the lines are just incredible. Yeah, I did want to ask about the narrator. He wasn't a quintessential New York voice. It wasn't Jerry Seinfeld. It wasn't Billy Crystal, where a lot of times that's what you see in these type of stories, these New York stories. Talk to me about the process of choosing this narrator's voice and tone.
Yeah, in this case, I thought less was more. I didn't want it to be a caricature of itself. I didn't want like a big New York accent because, again, I think it was something of a somber time in New York, and it even though it was going to have a, obviously a lot of fun and so forth. I didn't want it to overdo itself. And also, there are all kinds of considerations in terms of who's available and so forth. But I had worked a little bit with Tate Donovan before. Tim Mullen, I mentioned, my editor, had worked with him, and I knew how good he was. And I also know that he's malleable in terms of like where he could take it. And even though he's on a classic New York voice, he did live in New York for a long time. He is a Met fan, and so he got it. And I want, we were together 3 hours on a voiceover session, and I knew that he would bring a certain amount of attention to it, and he did, and he was a great partner. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of different narrators, men, women, all kinds of stars, and then people you haven't even heard of. Actors who would work for scale, who are just phenomenal in the voiceover space. So it's a real skill, and you want to pay attention to who it is, because that can make or break a film when you're going to rely on narration that way.
Talk about the challenges. You only have 42 minutes to tell this story, right? But you were able to get into the details of each game. Like when you brought up Timo, I was like, oh, I forgot that they didn't run. I forgot all of those moments. Did you have to jar their memories of any of the people that you were interviewing, or did you just let them remember it and go from there?
Yeah, when you're doing these interviews, you kind of walk them through. You give these long questions, and you kind of go, in the fourth, this happened, the fifth, and that kind of, and occasionally sometimes they'll be like, wait, what happened again, and so forth. But I think that's a skill in terms of interviewing, and that's something that I've had to learn. I think I could always do better at, in terms of how you interview someone, because again, remember when you're interviewing them, ideally your audio is not going to be on camera or as part of it. That's become a tool that's a little more in vogue right now, which is great because it gives you a little flexibility and it kind of breaks that fourth wall a little bit. But yeah, I mean, you would walk them through. But these guys are pro athletes. It's like a golfer. You ask them about a pro golfer. You ask about a hole in a major 8 years earlier, and they take you through it inch by inch. And they do the same thing, like David Cohen and Mike Piazza in that at bat in Game 4, kind of pivotal at bat, the one pitcher, the one at bat that Cohen had that he faced. He pitched the third inning in the entire World Series, and it was the Piazza, and he got him out. And they both remembered that pitch for pitch and word for word. So that was a good thing, and they knew what they were coming in to talk about, right? So. They were pretty prepared. And even Joe Torre, who is 80 years old and still throwing fastballs, in terms of mentally, was great. I mean, he remembered everything.
I thought he was phenomenal. The reason why I asked that question, because we've done it different ways. I've done it where I've given them video and had them watch it and try to go through that. And I was curious if you did any of those triggers or not. But I'll go to Joe Torre. When he said to be loyal to 25 instead of 1, I thought that was a great line. And I totally forgot him bringing in Cohen for Nagel. So it's just like, damn, Joe Torre was on it. He remembered it like it was yesterday.
And you really got to be disciplined when get back to your question, AJ, about the 42 minutes. It's like, that will go by so fast. When you're and so for me, it was kind of each game can have one thing in it, and hopefully we had the characters we had. Derek Jeter, we did an interview. Mariano Rivera, we did an interview, but you can, and they had their moments in the series for sure, but it was like you're interviewing David Cohen, and then he kind of has his arc, and the crest in Game 4. And Al Leiter, he appears in Game 1 and Game 5, but he's such a great character in the film, and then you feel him experience, as he's looking back at himself 20 years earlier. Zeal has his moment with Timo Perez, so everybody kind of had their little moment, and certainly, obviously, Clemens and Piazza. So it's kind of, to me, it's like, eliminate all the other stuff and just go big where you're going to go big. And then, get moment to moment to moment, I think is the best way to go.
I have to say, you made a 5-game series feel like a 7-game thriller.
No, I appreciate that. And, and no, thank you. But the joke is that every game was decided by either 1 or 2 runs, and kind of went down to the last at bat for one of the teams. So it was an oddly one-sided close World Series. It was like yes, the Yankees won in 5, but a lot of games a couple of games could have really easily gone the Mets' way.
Spoken like a true Met fan.
Yeah. We could have won.
I wanted to ask about the captain, number 2, Derek Jeter. Inconspicuously absent from the film. Can you let us know kind of some of the behind the scenes, the inside baseball on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's not even that much inside baseball. The fact is that you can say all you want about that guy. Derek Jeter is owning and essentially president, and at the time, I guess he had a GM underneath him. Now he's got K-Mang working for him, of course, but he was pretty involved. And like I said, baseball came back in July, and we were still figuring out all the stuff and getting our, budgets and so forth. So our first interview, I believe, was something like either August 24th or maybe even August 31st. And we delivered the film like October 1st. So it was kind of like we had a really tight set of windows. We would have loved for Jeter to come, but I also didn't really feel like it was necessary because he's just one of these guys who kind of floats above everything anyway. He's kind of like a god. And so, it wasn't something I pushed for. My big thing, honestly, as I was going through this, and again, you guys know this, like you're balancing so many things. Like when I'm just a writer, it's so easy comparatively because all I'm worrying about is the script. And when you're dealing with, looking at the whole car instead of the wheels, I put it, I really felt strongly, I wanted an equal number of Mets and Yankees. So every time I booked another Yankee, I was like, well, I want to make sure I have another Met. Like if we ended up with like 6 and 2, that would have been no good. So when we got to the point where we had enough, and again, it's that 42-minute film, and we could have pushed harder, I think, for Jeter at the end to maybe see, but it was like, I didn't want to, there's so much stuff that was on the floor to begin with that, I was totally content with, the characters we had telling the story.
It makes sense now that you tell it, because I was wondering like, oh, why didn't they get Tim McCarver? But the way you just explained it to us tells us why you left Tim McCarver out, which you didn't need him, but I was just curious about that.
And, and just to jump on this too, also, like I very much originally felt like we only wanted players and obviously the managers, which I was able to get Torrey and Valentine. Again, that was the thing where I really wanted both of them and I got them. So I was like, players. And I was like, wait a second. This was like right before we started rolling interviews. I said, wait a second, I might be messing up here. I wasn't sure if I sit down with the players, what if it doesn't mean that much to them, the Subway Series? Because it means something to fans. Like we're talking right now, the three of us, obviously Seth, Red Sox, and me and AJ with the Mets. And so I was like, shoot, like I think I should do some fans. And so that was the one where I had the one Yankee fan who is this guy who then it kind of reveals later in the film is, again, these guys have their own arcs. He's the president of the 9/11 museum. So he kind of emerges that way. And then I ended up, that was the thing. I was working on a Met fan and then he wouldn't get back to me. I was just having trouble, connecting with him. And so then I was really grateful. My friend Josh Oshinsky, who has worked at MLB, who's a great storyteller himself, he put me in touch with a guy named Darren Meenan, who is the head of the 7-Line Army, which is like the Mets official fan club and t-shirt thing, and a really neat guy. And Darren not only helped me with one of the fans, but then got me another one. So I had 2 Mets fans. And I interviewed them both. And I was like, I'm going to get them both in. And I did. One of them is a guy named Mike Marshall, who is sort of, again, is revealed in the film, is a vendor. Then
by the way, Mike Marshall looked like your brother.
Is that right? You think?
I thought he was related. Yeah, our brother-in-law, cousin.
Yeah.
I thought there was some similarities there.
Too funny. So, and again, like it's poignant because Mike Marshall talked about being a vendor and this and that, and then in the pandemic, Mike Marshall hasn't been working. P.S. I mentioned to you guys before we started rolling that I went to the Met game the other night, and I texted Mike Marshall, and I ended up, getting to, because we had never met in person because I had just seen him on the Zoom, and so he came over to our section. He's actually been promoted. He's now running like the vendors for Aramark at Citi Field. Great dude, and it was really nice to be able to meet him in person.
That's such awesome. A cool story. And I love the bus driver too. He was just a quintessential Met fan. Yeah, George was totally. He's a total Met fan, and he couldn't even say their name. Like I'm like, oh, that's so true. Like he's just such a Met fan.
Great guy, and an MTA bus driver who insisted on taking the subway to Astoria. For the shoot, he basically was on his break when we shot it as a bus driver and came and yeah, another terrific guy.
I love the way you revealed who those fans were at the end, and it all made sense. When earlier in the film you're wondering where do they cast these guys, so that was a nice piece there.
Yeah, no, it was obviously purposeful, and I was glad we were able to pull it off that way.
I'm going to go back to the details of the game for a second because I love the way you set up the Clemens and Piazza. And, I wanted Piazza to go beat Clemens' ass. Sorry for the younger, but I wanted him to go in that moment. And I knew the history, but I thought you guys did a really good job of setting that up quickly, then revealing Clemens and letting him tell his side of the story. Was that your goal the whole time, or how did that work out?
That is all Timmy Mullen, my editor, who was on the Zoom as I was doing the Clemens interview, or maybe not even the Clemens interview. I think he was when I was doing the Al Leiter interview. Okay. And Tim was just listening in, he was in the edit room, but that's one of the wonders of Zoom. And I finished the Leiter interview and he goes, dude, by the way, this is what we're doing with Clemens. Because at one point he had heard Leiter say, I don't know, you'd have to ask Roger. He goes, whatever Roger says, that's when we're bringing him in. So that's an interesting behind the scenes thing, right? Because first of all, I'm really grateful that Roger Clemens is going to talk to me. I was really great. I was like, and I, it's funny, right? I'm a journalist here. I'm trying to be objective, but I'm also not, I don't want to hang Roger Clemens out to dry because I appreciate the fact that, he's, and again, I'm a Met fan, right? So it's all these different emotions. And Clemens came and I was really nervous because I knew, it was sort of like, oh, well, we're going to ask about this, but it's a lot more and, that kind of thing. And Roger sat down. He couldn't have been nicer. He couldn't have been more gracious. And he spoke at, the interview went over an hour and he was happy to say, and he was really passionate about talking about 9/11 in New York and so forth. And so, but it was like, you know what, this is the right thing for the story. So Clemens doesn't show up until Al Leiter says in the middle of that moment, I don't know what Clemens was thinking. You'd have to ask Roger. And then he sits down. And again, it's one of these things where you're thinking as a storyteller. So make sure your camera guy's rolling before he sits down so you can kind of create that moment. And, so that was all Tim and it worked out, really well.
That's awesome. Another classic Tim Mullen edit was when Bernie Williams breaks down in the interview and then he uses that video with Joe Torre underneath talking about Bernie Williams. I mean, goosebumps. I mean, that's Tim Mullen, at his best right there.
Yeah, it's great editing. Like it's again, we're getting really in the weeds here, but I imagine, the people listening to this would appreciate that. I think it's a really cool thing when you can pull it off, when you can have, just the kind of the extra material of characters just reacting, but not necessarily talking rather, I should say. And you can kind of play them off each other as if they're almost having a conversation. I think that's a really cool device and it's worked perfectly there. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was classic Tim Mullen. I wanted to ask you, being a New Yorker, comparing 9/11 to last year, the COVID pandemic in 2020, talk about the similarities, talk about the differences, compare those years in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to do quantitatively, but a friend of mine, put it in the moment in a way that I think it's held up more than a year later, which is the pandemic was 9/11 in slow motion, in the sense that, so I was living in New York on 9/11. I was walking to work across 42nd Street in an odd phase of a commute at the time when I would listen to Imus in the morning on a Discman or on a Walkman radio. I was again, many questionable decisions there in terms of listening to Imus in the morning and just anyway.
Not Howard Stern?
Right. No, I mean, just any number of, like I said, questions. So, I mean, I have an incredibly vivid, I had been living in New York for about a year in the city in terms of living in the city. And then I was, certainly in New York for the pandemic. It's one of these things where there's a certain amount of things you take for granted in terms of your just everyday, right? And then you just get hit by the crosstown bus. We all do. And it's like a total disruption in everything. And you kind of recenter yourself, and both of them were incredibly dramatic. Both of them were incredibly tragic. And, as we've seen, the pandemic is in a lot of ways unfolding in slow motion. I'd like to believe that while New York bounced back in incredible ways after 9/11, the same thing's going to happen, now. I live in the city. I live in the city with my family, and I'm still, kind of passionate about New York City, and it's still a wonderful place. And, we'll see, but I'm certainly hopeful. And, we've come a long way since this film came out in the fall. But yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities.
I thought you did a good job of telling that part. I hadn't thought about it, but when you guys got to it, I was like, you know what, the city will bounce back. We lived there, Seth lived there, I lived there. And one of the lines, to go back to that game, you wrote a great line. You said, "Miracles you swear are coming right up until your last breath." And that set up game 5. And I remember thinking the same thing. Like, I was at game 5. I was on the other side of you. I was in left field on the blue seats. And I remember thinking, like, oh, we still got a chance. We still got a chance. But that line right there just took me right back to that moment. Was that one of those things you just had a bunch of lines and then you just sort of settled on that, and that transitioned you right into the last part of the series?
Yeah, I don't know where, like, it's funny. Some of the stuff just kind of comes out. I don't remember like struggling to write that line, but it just sort of comes out again. And it's a little bit of a foreshadow, right? Because Piazza's up, they're down 2 runs, the Mets get a runner on, and that's like sports. Like, every time, especially when you're again, it's a pretentious term, but when you're a storyteller, for us, like, if any of our teams are up and they're down 2, and you look and you're like, oh, like, he could get on base and then he could hit a home run to tie it, and that would be the great story. And so you're like, and then you know, essentially the very last breath of the Mets is Piazza hits this ball everybody thinks is going out, and Bernie Williams settles under it, you know, a couple, you know, 10 feet before the warning track. So again, I appreciate that, you know, the compliment on the line, and it's a good line, but the really best thing about the line is the idea behind it. You know, I mean, again, you got to write it in a way that works, but first you got to have the idea that puts it in that perspective for the viewer. And so, and again, I mentioned that sometimes it's 12 pages to get 1 page. And then sometimes when you're just writing about something and you're on a deadline, like, it just kind of comes out. And so that was that. Yeah.
I have to tell you, I was on the train by the time Bernie caught it. I was like, I'm out of here. I ain't watching it. Bernie said people don't remember it. I didn't remember it either. I was gone. That was so painful. I'm like, I'm not watching him celebrate on this field. I'm out of here.
We've all had our hearts broken at Shea Stadium or Citi Field, as it might have been called in 2000. My dad was actually at Game 6 in 1986. Woo. He had to take the 7 train back to the west side to his sister's house, my aunt's brownstone, and we literally didn't see him for about 2 months after that. Just a diehard Red Sox fan, and just straight depression for about 2 months before we saw him again. So we've all had our hearts broken over in Queens.
Yes, we have.
An awesome film, the Subway series. Just a remarkable time really in the city, and for you to check it out, I believe it's on all the Fox Sports apps, and I believe so anywhere, if you can tap into the Fox Sports digital, you should be able to watch that film. But definitely a film worth checking out. All right, we're going to get into Act 3. These are quick hitters. You don't have to dive too deep, but we're going to get into it. Seminal moment in your career.
Seminal moment in my career. Seminal moment in my career would be the second series of 24/7 in December of 2007, when Jason Hare, who better known as the director of The Last Dance, was show running that show, and he initially was ending these shows with montage, you know, training montages it was first De La Hoya Mayweather in the first series, the second series was Mayweather Hatton. And I made a suggestion. He's a great friend of mine. And I said, what if we gave Liev Schreiber, the narrator, an essay to, like, rather than that just be like explosions in the sky or whatever the, you know, music cut was, that, you know, that it could be kind of like an essay where the narrator is kind of ruminating on the sequence of the fight. And he said, yeah, let's give it a shot. And the opportunity to do that. And that first one was really co-written with Jason. I wrote some of it, and then we wrote it together. And that struck a chord creatively with a lot of people, and sort of has set a tone for the kind of writing that I've been able to do. That really is seen still in, you know, all these years later in something like the Subway series film.
You've worked on some great documentaries, rivalry-wise. You know, if it's Fab Five and they hate Duke, or, you know, McEnroe Borg. What was the best rivalry that you've worked on, or in telling any of those stories?
Oh, I mean, it's funny because HBO did a series of them, and so I was fortunate enough to work with Ezra Edelman on Magic and Bird. That's a phenomenal film that Ezra made, that I was fortunate to have a small part in, and McEnroe Borg, which Margaret Grassi directed at HBO Sports, which is another fabulous film. I mean, I'm sure I could keep thinking of other ones, but McEnroe Borg was neat because I really rooted hard for McEnroe growing up, and then kind of worked with him a little bit on live stuff in tennis, and he was a big part of some of the other HBO stuff I did on Bob Costas' show, and that was a pretty cool film. So I'm gonna go McEnroe Borg. Yeah, I'll cheat and just use one of the examples you gave me, AJ. But yeah,
I love it. I love it. The heyday of tennis. Where do you put all your Emmys? Where are your Emmys?
See, this is the kind of question that you're going to like excerpt and put on social media and just make me sound like a total asshole. But
we need to know. We need to know.
This is just awful. All right. So the writing ones are in my apartment in a few different places. At least, yeah, some of them. And a lot of them I've given to family members to have in their place, to their house or their apartment. I got a buddy in Chicago named Phil Hinsdale, who I'll give a shout out to, who's one of the great guys I've ever met. And he has one of the great man caves in his suburban Chicago household. And one day I needed a place to put him. And I just, with no comment, whatever, just sent Phil an Emmy. And it's in his man cave to this day. So, it's really cool. It's a neat thing. There are so many people who, like teachers and firefighters and police officers, all kinds of people who do amazing stuff. We're lucky to work in a business where if you do a good job, you get this trophy that, people think is cool. I think my favorite, Emmy thing, there's that Sopranos skit where one of this guy, Christopher Moltisanti's friend, is like a inveterate gambler or something and is trying to pawn his stuff, and he goes to try and pawn his Emmy, and they're like, nah, maybe an Oscar, and the bunch of has no use for an Emmy. So I like to think of that when I realize that, it's not much.
I'm right there with you. I give mine away too. I have a question for you about working with Costas. What's it like working with Bob Costas?
Again, you could talk about seminal moments or biggest breaks. I mentioned, Brian Brown got me in the Olympics, and then at HBO Sports, and really the first kind of job I had out of college consistently was working at HBO Sports on Bob's talk show. And that's, again, a massive break. One of the great, if not the greatest sports broadcaster of our time, but also a phenomenal writer. Guys like Bob Costas, Al Michaels, Vin Scully. Bob, a little more so, is better known for it because Bob has done studio work and essays and that kind of thing. But these guys with their voice are just such amazing writers, and Bob, because he's done more studio work, is in terms of the Olympics and so forth, the craft, learning from him as one of my great writing teachers was one of the great, kind of blessings of my career, and continues to be. And it's funny, like even the things that I did at HBO Sports that, were voiced by Liev Schreiber, you wouldn't put the two of them together, but it's kind of always like, would Bob read this? Would this be up to Bob's standards? And I carry that with me, to this day. And I'm not lying. I mean, it's just, in terms of a thinker who's going to call, BS on something. If you write something that's kind of a false note, I'm always on the lookout for that. And I think that's one of the foundations of hopefully being a decent writer. Yeah.
Most meaningful Emmy you have ever won?
Yeah, I guess the first writing Emmy was really, really cool because I think, it was sort of, once you start doing it, it becomes a goal of yours, goal of mine. And it was that 24/7 show, the Mayweather Hatton show that I mentioned. And so, that was really cool. And then, again, I have these different writing Emmys, and they've all been pretty cool. And some have kind of been a little more personal than others. I mean, like I in college, I wrote a whole bunch of papers about Muhammad Ali, and kind of became, to put it, obsessed with him. And then when he died, I had the opportunity to write his obituary for HBO Sports that Liev voiced, and I was lucky enough that won an Emmy. That meant a lot. So, a bunch of them. But any of the writing ones are pretty darn cool. To get, and I should say also the fact that the award is named after Dick Schaap, really makes it, more, even more so of an honor than just another Emmy.
Did you think about getting Liev for the documentary that we were talking about before?
Not too much. He's the voice of HBO Sports. I think I want to respect that. And so, and again, like so many of these narratives, Tate Donovan, I work with, others, plenty of others who are also fantastic, Bill Camp, et cetera. Like Liev's a little bit of a cheat code for me, right? And so it's just like, try something new, try something different. But I mean, I've done, he's been an amazing partner, and he's always been really generous, because he obviously does more interviews than me and has always shouted me out and so forth. And again, a guy who's really, really smart and gets it. When he goes in the booth, he knows how to read it. He asks the right questions, and he makes the right decisions. And he's really, really talented and smart.
Working with now California gubernatorial candidate Caitlyn Jenner for the ESPYs, a very important speech. What was that like, working with Caitlyn Jenner?
That was an incredible experience. That was a big deal. And a lot of people, I think, had questions about Caitlyn getting the Arthur Ashe Award for Courage. And in terms of my experience, it was phenomenal. And, I think that was really one of the high points in my career in terms of being a part of that, playing a small role. Really what I did, for the most part, was sit down with her, and it's kind of like, well, you're the, and I had been presented to her as someone who could help her with her speech and, my speech writer, et cetera. And the smartest thing I ever did with that project was sit down with Caitlyn. And again, it was a pretty intense experience in the sense that, she hadn't really been out in the world yet as Caitlyn. And I just looked at her, and I remember saying, all right, what do you want to say? And then just typed, and then we shaped it from there. And it was just really gratifying, the reception of that speech. And I think what it did, hopefully, for, perspective on trans people and so forth, was just an amazing opportunity, and really fortunate to do it. And I owe it all to Maura Mant, who was the producer of the ESPYs for forever. And unfortunately passed away unexpectedly just before the pandemic, about a year ago. That's just another person. Again, you talk about breaks and being lucky. I met her when I was 19 years old. I met Maura, and just a complete force of nature. And she made that whole thing happen, and then believed in me as someone who could help it out, help make it happen.
Rest in peace, Maura Mant. She gave a lot of opportunity to people in the industry. Did you go to the Malibu house and sit on the couch with Caitlyn?
I'll take the fifth. No. Yeah.
Did you?
I don't know if she's still in the same house, but yeah, that was where we had our meeting. Yeah, absolutely.
I know when she switched and they showed it on the Kardashian reality show, they all went to the Malibu house, sat around the couch. The famous couch.
That was where we met. That was where we met. Yep.
Wow.
In this business, it takes you to, some interesting places.
I will say I never watched the show, so I have no clue about the couch. But I'm going to ask you this. You could have dinner with one filmmaker or writer, since you are a writer. Who would that be? Or who would they be?
So, yeah, no. They would be, I would go with a guy named J.R. Moringer, so J.R. Moringer is a writer who is famous for a couple of things. He wrote a book called The Tender Bar, which is a memoir about growing up in a town on Long Island called Manhasset, where I grew up, as I mentioned earlier. And JR is about 15 years older than me, maybe 10, 12, 15 years older than me. And that's just an amazing book that I recommend everybody. It's just it's a coming of age story that just hits home with me for a lot of reasons. But first and foremost, that it takes place in my town. J.R. Moringer also ghost wrote Andre Agassi's book, Open, which is widely regarded as appropriately as one of the best sports memoir books ever. He also ghostwrote wrote another phenomenally successful book in sports space called Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. And so he's just a phenomenal writer. He's also written some great pieces for ESPN, the magazine. After in the fall, this was after Subway Series aired, I reread The Tender Bar. I think we've all done different things during the pandemic that were exercises either in nostalgia or just, different things. And I had read it originally 15 years ago. I reread the book, and it just, again, hit me in such a personal way that I shot him an email. I had his email address. I was able to find his email address, and I shot him an email, and it was totally fanned out. And I just said, I just want to let you know how much the book meant to me. And, I just thank you so much. And he wrote me right back, the next day. And it's just a nice response. And he was really grateful. So I don't want to overdo it. I appreciate him responding to my email, but hey, if you're asking me if he's going to be obligated to have lunch, I would love to have lunch with him. Yeah.
Favorite 24/7 you have ever written?
Love it. Love the question. So I'm going to go, well, all right. So it's good. I can answer twice. So there's a show we did for when Mayweather and Pacquiao finally fought in 2015. It's not technically a 24/7. It's called At Last, Mayweather Pacquiao at Last. And the writing I did for that, because it's like you're always holding something back in the holster because you're waiting for that fight. So you can't really blow it out when it's only Mayweather Cotto or it's only Pacquiao Margarito, right? Like it's like, but when that comes, that's the biggest fight of the generation. There's no overstating anything. There's not like that's too much. And Bentley Weiner, who is now heads of documentaries at HBO Sports, but is a phenomenal talent, directed that show, and she's been an amazing partner. And so the writing I did on that show is kind of a favorite. In terms of 24/7, I would say the second hockey show we did, which was Rangers Flyers, the close for that, again, in collaboration with Bentley and an editor named Dan Marks, was something I'm really proud of. And then going way back, just in terms of kind of figuring out and kind of, I don't want to say perfecting the art because it's not perfect, but getting better. If you want to check out, all these things are on YouTube. So that's why I mentioned them, because people can actually check them out. Pacquiao Hatton. Check out the close for that show, which was about Las Vegas and kind of like, again, it's kind of writing big and going crazy. So those are the random, I mean, the notion that you're making me answer these questions, people are going to make fun of me someday, but there you go.
It's unfortunate that the Pacquiao Mayweather fight didn't live up to the hype, which was epic. The hype was so good, and the fight was a dud. Yeah. But hey, like, again, it's that thing where we can fantasize about what that perfect miracle is, that perfect story. And like, it was just, again, one of the lines, not to, you guys are making me embarrassed, but like one of the lines in that close of Pacquiao Mayweather was something like, have faith in a craft that makes such a spectacle possible, and that's, the idea that boxing can get you this pumped up.
And I agree. I think 24/7, this show was better than the fight, because each week I look forward to watching it and just enjoying that, the way you would weave us through, and just everything, all the whole story was just phenomenal. I'm going to ask you, which sports doc, and there's so many, I don't want to drill you into what are some sports docs that you enjoy that you would recommend?
Totally. So, I mean, look, if you haven't seen OJ Made in America, it's not a sports doc per se, but it's the best thing I've ever seen in the nonfiction space. It's done by Ezra Edelman, who is a seminal talent and a great mentor of mine. Again, like I mentioned, he's another guy who came out of HBO Sports. So I think that's sort of high and above. In terms of, films that people maybe haven't seen, I mentioned Mike Talasian earlier, who ended up running original programming from Fox, but he made a film called Once Brothers that was a 30 for 30 that I love, that again was one of these great stories that you kind of knew about the basketball with the split of Yugoslavia in the 90s. That's a terrific one. I'll get in trouble if I start naming others, because then I'll leave a few out. But I just think it's really cool that the three of us have kind of gone through the business. The sports documentary space has opened up so much that, like, that's a question that if you asked 10, 15 years ago, like, it's like, what do you mean? Like, is that a thing? And it's really a thing now.
It was like,
it
was
cool.
Hoop Dreams and HBO.
Yeah. And now, I mean, it's just exploded. And I think we're all really fortunate for that. I think as creators, and then also as viewers.
For someone that wants to be the next Aaron Cohen, what's one thing that you've done throughout your career that you would recommend them doing?
So I don't know. I mean, in terms of writing and all that, I mean, I will say, and I bet this goes for all three of us, I was a really good PA. Like, I worked my ass off. I came early. I stayed late. I remember one time I mentioned I was an intern at The View, and I was there, and all these interns were sitting around, and it was like, what's going on? And it was like the Xerox machine was broken. At the time, that was an important tool. Now nobody prints anything, and we're waiting for the guy to fix it. And it was like, I go up and it was like paper jam. It wasn't like the thing was like, had some massive electromagnet. So I opened up the damn thing and fixed it, and then it started working again. It's like, make shit happen. Sorry, make something happen. But here's the thing, like, that put me in a position 5-6 years later when I got promoted to then start that being a really good PA had little to do with being a good writer. Like, sure, I probably wrote like a good email now and then or something, but it was about working hard to get in the position to then sort of flourish as like a creative person. So like if you're asking me with the next, like then I imagine I'm addressing a young person, and like it's just hard work. It is so easy to distinguish yourself. The world does not work hard. The world is always looking to go home, right at 5 o'clock, or worrying about what they're going to do this weekend. And like hard work is like the most transparent currency to success, to giving yourself an opportunity. And it's sort of undefeated in that sense, I think.
And I want to just ask, as far as being a writer, which is a pretty unique position in the sports television industry, what would you recommend? Is it reading great books? Is it keeping a journal? Is it writing every day? How can they sharpen their tool?
I think all three of those, Seth, are good calls. They're good places to start. And also, don't be intimidated by the notion of like poetry. Like people use it all the time. It's fine. I'm getting to be like, hey, and Aaron will put some poetry to it. It's not the poetry that's setting it apart. It's the idea. It's the idea. Like, again, I have to use it as a teaching tool. So like, forget the obnoxiousness of it. But that Pacquiao Mayweather show I mentioned, the close of it has a line: all great fighters, I'm paraphrasing, all great fighters rise to the top in the same way. They do the same things over and over again. Now, how did that idea come about? Because I was sitting down with Bentley, the director, and Abtin Motia, the producer, and they were like, look, in terms of the close, and again, this was an interesting thing in terms of storytelling, not to get too off track, but they didn't have a lot of new footage for that show. So it actually took advantage of the library that they had of like 10, 15 years of Pacquiao Mayweather. And so Abtin was like, I'm not sure what we have, but we have a ton of shots of them doing the same thing, like, running and working the speed bag and this and that. And I was like, I had an idea. It's that the way you become a great boxer is you keep working, you keep training, you do the same thing over and over again. And like, that's not a particularly poetic line. It certainly sounds that way with great music and Liev Schreiber saying it, but it's the idea. So don't be intimidated by the words. Think about the idea. I'll tell you another thing. You can cut it out if you want. I'll tell you another story though.
Keep going.
We love it.
We did a show, Mayweather Marquez, 24/7. Gabe Spitzer, who now runs all like original nonfiction series at Netflix. Okay. I mean, again, HBO Sports, amazing launching pad to phenomenally, successful careers. And Gabe is one of the smartest guys I've worked in TV. He was directing at the time, and he said, and again, with these 24/7s, you're doing them over and over again with the same fighters. You're kind of running out of things. Gabe has a nice idea. He says, we shot in Mexico City at I think it's the Cleto Reyes boxing glove factory. So we're just going to shoot all this stuff. And again, Gabe says, no disrespect, and I'm kind of, you'll write some poetry about it. Okay, I'll write some poetry about it. What did I write about it? I'm like, well, what am I going to write? I'm sitting there. I'm like, I don't know, like gloves. What a glove, it protects the hand. It's not actually the hand. It's like all this, BS, right? So what I do? I Google it, and I Google the boxing glove company. They have a website and they have a story. And so I told the story again in a slightly poetic way of how this guy Cleto Reyes began making boxing gyms in a factory on the outskirts of Mexico City. There's a story the workers tell. I'm looking at the script right now. A boy wanted to box, but the beating he took, as a kid, the beating he took convinced him never to fight again. Instead, he started a business using horsehair, cowhide, and a handful of other materials. Again, I knew they had horsehair, cowhide, right? Because you're writing to picture. The man began making boxing gloves for fighters who had the courage he did not. Okay, that's I hear the story, and then it's like, oh, he didn't want to be a boxer, he wanted to make boxing gloves. He makes, and so you put a little bit of a spin on it. But again, the point is, have the ideas, come up with the ideas. The writing will follow.
It's a great story. I have to tell you, I'm getting prepared to go through all the information and things to go to Japan for the Olympics. I'm a little nervous, but I'm looking forward to going. What are your favorite Olympics that you've been to, and are you looking forward to going to Japan?
Yeah, so I would say Beijing was the coolest, just in terms of like life experience and just getting to go to China and experiencing that Olympics. Sydney, a solid second. That was the first Olympics I went to. I was like a runner, and I didn't have that much to do. And yeah, I'm completely looking forward to going to Tokyo. It'll certainly be a little different, but I'm just, excited for it to be a world event that, hopefully is kind of one of the first times the world's, coming together. And hopefully, we can celebrate and look forward to, hopeful times coming.
Last question from me. Who is one person you'd like to hear on this podcast?
I'm going to cheat. And I actually spoke to him today. I would throw Kevin Shaw, a former colleague of both Seth and mine. I don't know if AJ knows him, but a terrific filmmaker based out of Chicago who's really, really good about talking about story, and is a guy who has flourished in this kind of, the space of ESPN and the NFL Network, and also in the independent film world, and a guy I completely admire. And again, a guy that's where Seth and I met, working on a show on the NFL Network that Kevin and I did.
Absolutely. I think I can make that happen. I want to say, I always said working with Aaron is like shooting it off the backboard and it always goes in. It was like LJ 4-point play every time working with Aaron Cohen. To me, the best writer in all of sports media. Just a great guy out there. Aaron, you've given us plenty of time. You've given us overtime. We are wrapped.
Thank you, guys. It was an honor, and really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk about the business and storytelling and all that stuff. We're lucky to do it.
A huge thank you to Aaron Cohen for giving us that masterclass in storytelling. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show, and if you do, we will shout you out as one of our MVP listeners. We'll be back next week with another great episode of Beyond the Lens, and that's a wrap. And I'd like to give a special thanks to our editors, Jacob Gorenberg and Andrew Holman, and our production assistant, Candace Evans.